And joining me now is Erin Einhorn with Chalkbeat Detroit. And Chalkbeat Detroit is part of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, which Detroit Public Television is a part of as well. And so we're all working on stories about Detroit. And specifically, you guys have been looking at education in the city of Detroit. So thanks for joining me. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. You too.
All right. So when we kind of sit and look at where we are with Detroit Public Schools, it's half the year is almost over. And I want you to give me your impression of how the school year has gone so far and what kinds of things that you're looking at in terms of analyzing how successful the schools are doing, and then how successful the superintendent has been, because everyone is watching that as well.
Right. Well, I think there's definitely sort of a new feeling, I think, over the last few months. There's a new school board, obviously, which is now coming up on its 1-year anniversary. Or actually, I think maybe it has been 1 year. There's a new superintendent. There's definitely more of a feeling of hopefulness, I think, that we've had this year than we had in the past. Years of emergency management, years of difficulty. The new superintendent, Dr. Vitti, has brought certainly a lot of confidence to the role that he's in. He has an air of competence. He's brought, I think most of the people who've met him, the people I talked to who've met him, who've heard him speak, come away generally feeling pretty positive about what he's going to do.
Do they feel that he's accessible to them more so than any of the emergency management has been before?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's everywhere, right? He does a lot of media, he does a lot of TV, he does a lot of radio, he does a lot of public events. He'll stay and take questions. He'll take a lot of questions. He gives kind of long answers, and I think for the most part he's telling people what they do want to hear, which is, I'm going to expand programs. I'm going to expand art and music and robotics and gifted programs and AP programs and foreign language programs, like all the stuff that this district hasn't had in quite some time. That's fairly standard in more affluent school districts. The question's going to be, obviously, whether that's actually going to be able to happen.
So what have you been able to see so far from this first half of a year that he is going to be able to implement some of the things that he's telling parents, hang on, wait, this is what we want to be able to do?
I think there are some very serious challenges. I mean, so he says he can find the money in the budget to pay for things like arts and music, because, a lot of things in the Detroit schools have been, purchasing was at the school level. And so by bringing some of the contracts, centralizing, creating efficiencies, you can find more money. But you can't create an art and music program unless you can hire enough arts and music teachers. So just funding the programs isn't enough. And the biggest challenges facing this district isn't just money. It's the teacher shortage, which has caused all kinds of serious problems. And Dr. Vitti, despite his best efforts, has so far not been able to address that. Now, he's got some programs that he says are going to address it over time, but people are going to want to see change, and they're going to want to see change quickly. And I think he'd be the first to say that change is going to take, it's going to take some time before we see any real...
Well, especially at some of the schools that the state is now watching and saying that you have certain benchmarks that you have to achieve, or we're going to have to reassess the state of where the school is and maybe have to do something about it. What are those schools doing right now to try to change things?
Yeah, so there were 24 schools in the district that were put on a closure list last year and told, we're going to shut you down at the end of the year. And then there was a lot of political opposition. Those schools were allowed to stay open when they went into this state partnership program, in which they committed to meet certain benchmarks over the next 18 months, 3 years. And then an additional group of schools were put into that program more recently. So now it's like 50 schools, which is almost half the schools in the district. And they're in that program because they have had persistently low test scores, some of the lowest test scores in the state. So those schools need to bring those scores up, and they need to do so quickly in order to, continue. And that's really, really very difficult.
Well, that takes leadership from the principals who are in the building, but again, it goes back to teachers and making sure that you have the right amount of teachers in the classroom, but the ones that are qualified to be able to teach these kids at a level or meet them where they are right now.
Well, it's also important to note that, you know, a lot of people will look at those schools and say, oh my gosh, you know, 3% of kids are meeting state standards in their grade level. And they'll think, well, that school is terrible, nothing's happening in that school. But what they don't realize often is that kids come into the school, you know, maybe, you know, a fifth grader comes in reading at third grade level, and the teacher works with that child and works really hard with that child and brings that child up to fourth grade level, or say, you know, fourth grade and a half, right? You get a year and a half of growth, but
it's still not fifth grade level.
It's still not fifth grade level, so that when that child takes the state exam, the M-STEP, that child's not going is essentially going to show up as though they didn't pass the test. And so schools, the Detroit schools in general, are really faced with having to do two really difficult things at the same time. They got to bring the kids up from where they were, and they have to teach grade level material. So you have to teach, say in a math class, you might have to teach whole numbers and fractions simultaneously so that they'll catch up from where they were and be where they're supposed to be, and that's really very difficult. So I don't think anyone expects that, you know, kids are going to start taking the exam, you know, in a couple of months. I don't think there's any reason to think the scores will be appreciably different than they have been in the past. And so then people are going to say, well, you know, to the superintendent, you know, you're supposed to be this great hope. Why aren't we seeing change? And he's going to say patience. It's going to take time, and we'll see how much leeway people are going to give him before they start saying, oh, you know, this is bad, we need to change it.
We need to change it up again, but there has been so much change, or like, you know, 2 years, change again, 3 years, change again, that you have to end up sticking with something. You wrote a really interesting article. You were in this huge room where principals had to stand up and kind of give a progress report, not only to the superintendent, but to all of their peers, the principals at the other schools, and say, well, this is the challenges that we have, you know, kind of in front of an accountability squad of some sort. What are some of the feelings that principals have, or some of the issues that they're having, and the concerns about, I guess, sharing that in front of an entire room of their peers?
Yeah, the mood in that room was one of like high anxiety. I mean, I was in this room and there were, you know, several dozen principals they were each going to get 5 minutes in the hot seat, and it really is a hot seat. I mean, they are in there, and the superintendent and all the top district administrators are around the room, plus all of their peers, all the principals, and they have 5 minutes to, Dr. Vitti calls it a data chat. Like, you go and you show your data, and you have to show, you know, not just your test scores, but also your absence rate. And, you know, there were serious, you know, questions about what are you doing to recruit teachers and fill your vacancies, and what are the challenges you're facing? And a lot of the principals on the way in expressed a great deal of fear, like, oh my God, what's this going to be like? Am I going to be publicly humiliated in front of my colleagues? But I found a lot of them, you know, just sort of watching them and then talking to them during breaks, is that they really appreciated that opportunity to share notes, because I think in this district there hadn't been a lot of communication. The principals I spoke with said nothing like this had ever, you know, had taken place in time that they could remember, where they're saying, here's the challenges I'm facing, and another person says, well, here's the solution that I have created for that.
That I've figured out over on the west side of the city that maybe you're having over on the east side of the city, which would almost be baffling to me that nothing like that had ever taken place before, so they can exchange the ideas or the issues that they've been having.
Yeah, and there were a bunch of things that they raised that it surprised me that I didn't know. You know, like a lot of the schools will say, you know, if the school is K to 5, that, you know, when the child advances to 6th grade, the parent will move the whole family, including the younger siblings, to another school. And so one of the schools said, oh, well, we came up with a way to address that by we now have busing to the nearby middle school, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because that's another thing I wanted to talk about. We know that the enrollment is up, but talk to me a little bit about that mobility, that maybe people don't quite understand, that you have families that are searching maybe for the next school, or they show up for half the year and then they're gone due to different kind of circumstances, and the chronic absenteeism that can also really impact what's happening in the classroom.
Well, that kind of speaks back to the challenges that the schools are facing that are trying to, bring kids back, bring kids up to where, up to grade level. That in many cases isn't a child who was in this school last year. So Detroit has probably one of the, certainly most likely the highest mobility rate in the state. Mobility is a measure of turnover, student turnover. So this is a city where parents, families have many options of schools. You can go to charter schools, you can go to district schools, you can go to suburban schools, and families, there's unstable housing, foreclosure, all kinds of things going on. People move a lot. And so many children in this district, in Detroit, many Detroit children, you'll talk to them and by the time they're in 8th grade, they've attended 2, 3, 4, 5 schools, and they've had a different teacher. And so, so the child comes in and they're not prepared, and it's not somebody, you have to kind of go hunt down their records from last year. And so that's a real significant challenge that families face. And so enrollment is up in the district, and the superintendent obviously was very, he had a press conference to announce it. But the reality is enrollment is so unstable in all Detroit schools. This isn't a district problem. This is just
charter schools, everything.
Everything. Enrollment's just unstable, and some years it's up and some years it's down, and it's really difficult to say. There's so many different reasons why families change schools. It's hard to say, oh, well, that's a trend. We'd need a lot more years of data to say that.
And parents are also looking for the best options for their kids as well. And part of that, and you wrote about this, is also finding the transportation or the ability to get your kids to the best schools that you can possibly get them to, because they may not be in your neighborhood, which is pretty difficult too.
And a study just came out sort of that looked at the availability of schools in different neighborhoods, and it found that there's 10 Detroit neighborhoods where there's virtually no schools of any real quality, and they used state ratings to measure quality, but they found 10 neighborhoods that they essentially declared to be education deserts. Like, you can't, if you live in that neighborhood, you cannot get a quality education where you live. You need to travel, and 25% of Detroit families don't have a car, and the public transportation system is not where it
as we well know, is not exactly where it needs to be. Let me ask you this. So if you look at, we go towards the end of the year, the end of the school year in June, what for you will you have had to either see happen, or what do you hope to see by the end of the year that you'll be able to check and say, now we've made some kind of progress here, or there's been finally some kind of change or difference in how the district is run and how people feel about the district?
I mean, I think I'd want to see some progress. I mean, on teacher hiring. I mean, the vacancies, there were, I think, 150 or so vacancies at the start of the school year. From what I understand, that number's grown as teachers have left or retired. So there needs to be some kind of serious demonstration that that's going to change, because I think if you don't change that, you're not going to be able to change much. Big question next year is, will enrollment move? I think it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, I don't know that we'll see much. You're asking, what are we going to see by the spring?
Right.
I'd be surprised if we see much different than what we see right now, but there's a lot of programs that are in the works. There's a lot of things that are happening. I'll definitely be watching it. I'll definitely be covering it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so you must have a big whiteboard of all the various different things that you want to cover about Detroit schools. Can you give us anything that you're working on that you can share with us now that we'll end up seeing through the DJC circles yet? Or am I really, they're like, it's the new year, Christy, it's the first week back. I mean, what are you thinking?
Well, you hit on a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the absenteeism is a major thing we're looking at. School funding in general, I think, is a really interesting issue. A report just came out showing how the amount of money that schools need to spend to educate a child with special needs is significantly higher than what the state is providing. So is that going to change? Is it, you know, that especially affects districts like Detroit that have a disproportionately high number of those kids. So that's an additional challenge. So we'll definitely be watching that.
We'll see. We'll be looking forward to your reporting on Chalkbeat Detroit. And of course, we'll have a link at MiWeek.org to all of your work. Thanks, Erin Einhorn, for joining me. It's good to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.